On October 19, 2025, four thieves broke into the world-famous Louvre Museum, and in just 7 minutes flat, they walked out with 8 pieces of priceless jewelry worth a combined 88 million euros. The world was stunned. The Louvre itself has a history stretching back centuries. It started out as a massive defensive fortress in the late 1100s, then became a royal palace for the French monarchy in the 14th century. It wasn't until King Louis XIV packed up the entire royal court and moved to Versailles that the Louvre slowly reinvented itself, eventually opening to the public as a museum in 1793. Today, it's one of the oldest and largest museums on the planet, with over 200 years of history behind it. The deep irony? This building was literally built to protect things, and yet, generation after generation, criminals have found ways to slip through its defenses and make off with irreplaceable treasures. Now, some outlets call the 2025 robbery the crime of the century, but honestly, when you look back through history, there are earlier cases that were just as bold, sometimes even bolder, pulled off faster and involving far more stolen pieces. So, what exactly has the Louvre lost over the past 100+ years? Which masterpieces have disappeared from its walls? And how did that jaw-dropping 2025 heist actually go down? Let's get into it. The first theft on record at the Louvre happened back in 1907. A man named Gary Pierret strolled into the museum, tucked a small Iberian sculpture under his clothes, and just walked out. Security back then was almost laughably lax. Nobody stopped him. Nobody even noticed. And that apparently gave him a taste for it, because over the following years, Pierret kept coming back, using the exact same method, helping himself to more sculptures every single time without ever being caught. He actually bragged about it to his friends, telling them that stealing from the Louvre was easier than shopping at a regular store. Then, 4 years later, things took a turn nobody saw coming. Pierret wrote a letter to the Paris Journal, a major Parisian daily, flat out confessing that he'd stolen a statue from the Louvre and offering to return it in exchange for 50,000 French francs. The statue he mentioned in that letter was at least the third item he'd taken. As for the earlier pieces, he claimed he'd already sold them to a couple of friends in Paris. And those friends? They turned out to be none other than Pablo Picasso and his close friend, the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Picasso's mistress later confirmed it. Pierret had given Picasso one statue and sold him another. In the letter, Pierret never explained where the pieces came from. He just cryptically told them not to display them anywhere too obvious. Picasso, who was deeply interested in that style of sculpture at the time, was thrilled. He stashed them away carefully at the back of his closet. Until the moment both he and his friends realized the horrifying truth. Those statues had been stolen from the Louvre. They panicked. That same night, they wrapped everything up and quietly returned the pieces to the museum through a newspaper office, completely anonymously. So why did Pierret suddenly decide to come clean to the press in 1911 of all years? Because 1911 was also the year the Louvre suffered what would become the most famous art theft in history. One August morning, a temporary museum worker named Vincenzo Peruggia waited until the gallery was empty, then grabbed Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa right off the wall with his bare hands and walked out with it. His method was almost insultingly simple. Find the painting, take it down, walk away. That's it. Staff didn't even notice it was gone that day. It wasn't until the following morning, when a visitor pointed out the empty space on the wall, that the alarm was finally raised. Because of the earlier statue thefts, Picasso and his circle fell under suspicion all over again. It took the police 2 full years to track down the real thief. Peruggia claimed he'd done it as a patriotic act. He believed the painting rightfully belonged to Italy and wanted to bring it home. He ended up sentenced to just 1 year and 15 days in prison. And in one of history's great ironies, it was this theft, more than anything else, that turned the Mona Lisa into the most famous painting in the world. Fast forward to 1939. A painting worth over 7 million French francs, a serious amount of money at the time, went missing from the Louvre. The piece was L'Indifférent, a masterwork by the celebrated French painter Antoine Watteau, A tour guide leading a group through the gallery was the one who first noticed it was gone and flagged it to museum staff. Remarkably, it took 2 more days before police issued any kind of public statement about the theft. The man behind it was a 24-year-old named Serge Bogosian Slaoui, an obscure artist who claimed to be a descendant of the famous sculptor Jean-Baptiste Pagaille. During one of his visits to the museum, Serge had noticed something that most people would have walked right past. The painting was hanging on the wall by nothing more than a thin steel wire. So he came back. Day after day, visit after visit, he quietly reached up and gave that wire a little twist. 2 weeks of that and the wire finally snapped. He lifted the painting off the wall, wrapped it in newspaper, and carried it out like it was nothing. 2 months later, Serge walked into the judicial authorities and handed the painting back. His explanation? He'd been holed up in his attic, just a short walk from the Louvre, carefully restoring it. That, he insisted, was the whole point. He believed the museum's previous conservators had badly botched the restoration, and he'd taken it upon himself to fix what he saw as their mistakes. He stripped the frame, cleaned the canvas, and treated the areas he thought were wrong. Experts who later examined the painting disagreed sharply with his assessment. His amateur intervention had actually caused serious damage to the work. Serge was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Then came 1976, and this time it wasn't a painting that went missing, it was a sword. Specifically, the sword of Charlemagne. The blade stretched 93.5 centimeters long, with a silver hilt set with numerous diamonds, and it had originally been used during Charlemagne's own coronation ceremony. At the time of the theft, the museum's exterior was being cleaned, and workers had set up metal scaffolding along the outside walls. In the early morning hours, 3 thieves used that scaffolding to climb up to the second floor, smashed a window, and forced their way into the display room. When 2 security guards came to investigate the noise, the thieves attacked them directly, one of the rare cases in Louvre history where criminals physically confronted museum staff. Another employee heard the commotion and called the police, but by then it was too late. The thieves grabbed the sword and disappeared into the night. To this day, nobody knows who those 3 men were, and the sword of Charlemagne has never been found. 7 years later, in 1983, the Louvre lost something else entirely: 2 full suits of 16th century armor, believed to have been crafted in Milan during the Renaissance, inlaid with crystals and elaborately decorated. With a combined value of around 500,000 euros, when the museum closed that evening, the armor was right where it was supposed to be. When staff arrived the next morning, it was gone. Someone had slipped inside overnight and taken both suits. Police launched an investigation but came up completely empty. The case went cold for nearly 4 decades. Then, in 2021, an antiques expert was brought in to appraise items for a heritage auction. Something about 2 suits of armor caught his eye. He flagged it to the authorities. They were confirmed to be the exact pieces stolen from the Louvre back in 1983. Moving into 1990, the Louvre got hit twice in the span of just 3 days in July. First, a portrait of a seated woman disappeared. Then, roughly a dozen gold coins dating back to the 2nd century vanished as well. The culprit was a 21-year-old Frenchman who had simply walked in during regular visiting hours, pulled out a small knife, and sliced the painting right out of its frame. That same day, he pulled the exact same move at another museum across town. All told, he walked away with at least 3 paintings. When the investigation wrapped up, the Louvre had to admit something embarrassing. The alarm system was wired to the frames themselves, but it hadn't actually been activated. Nobody noticed the thing until it was too late. The paintings were eventually recovered, but the damage to the museum's reputation was done. The press had a field day, mocking the Louvre as a, quote, self-service museum. Management responded by promising to beef up security. It didn't stick. Just 5 years later, another thief used the exact same technique, knife, frame, done, to cut a landscape oil painting called Landscape with a Road right off the wall. Total value, around 300,000 euros. The whole job took 5 minutes. Then, a week after that, a stone battle axe attached to a 17th century statue inside the museum went missing. This wasn't some small trinket. The axe weighed around 17 kilograms and was firmly bolted to a stone base. Removing it would have taken at least 5 minutes of obvious physical effort. 4 security guards were posted in the immediate area. Not one of them noticed anything. Museum management eventually found the battle axe sitting in the courtyard outside. The leading theory? The thief brought it out, realized it was basically worthless on the black market, and quietly left it behind. The last major theft of the 20th century at the Louvre came in 1998, and this one has never been solved. The target was a painting called The Storm by French artist Claude-Joseph Vernet, valued at over 6 million euros. It was hanging in a gallery that had no surveillance cameras and no alarm system of any kind. On a Sunday afternoon, the thief blended into the crowd of visitors, pried open the display case, and calmly cut the painting free. The museum realized what had happened quickly, but the culprit was long gone by then. Art experts later noted that a painting this recognizable would be nearly impossible to sell through any legitimate channel. And yet, decades later, it still hasn't turned up. It remains the one unsolved mystery from the Louvre's 20th century thefts, and the painting has never been seen again. When you add it all up, media reports estimate the Louvre has been hit more than 10 times over the past century, with over 40 artifacts lost along the way. And when you think about what this place actually is, 240,000 square meters of building, 198 galleries, more than 400,000 artifacts. It's not hard to understand why criminals keep coming back. This is one of the 4 greatest museums on Earth. For the wrong kind of people, that makes it the ultimate target. To really understand how the 2025 heist went down, it helps to know the layout of the place. So let's take a look at the map. The Louvre is made up of 3 large wings arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. Right in the middle of that courtyard sits the iconic glass pyramid, designed by architect I.M. Pei, which serves as the museum's main entrance. Visitors descend through it into an underground reception hall, where they're funneled out into the 3 main exhibition areas. Altogether, those exhibition spaces cover over 60,000 square meters, spread across 3 interconnected wings. The Sully Wing, on the east side, is the oldest part of the building and houses ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman antiquities. The Richelieu Wing, running along the north, is the largest of the 3. It's where you'll find Near Eastern antiquities, royal French furniture, and sculpture. The famous Code of Hammurabi stele lives there too. Then there's the Denon Wing, stretching along the south side near the Seine River, which is home to ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan sculptures, along with monumental Italian, Spanish, and French oil paintings. 2 of the Louvre's 3 crown jewels, the Mona Lisa and the Winged Victory of Samothrace, are both in the Denon Wing. The third, the Venus de Milo, is over in the Sully Wing. Because of that, these 2 wings draw the heaviest foot traffic in the entire museum. The area where they intersect is constantly packed with tourists, which, as history has shown, creates exactly the kind of cover that criminals love to exploit. It's no coincidence that this zone has seen more thefts than anywhere else in the building. Now let's zoom in on that intersection. Directly to the north, facing the glass pyramid, is the Red Room, the gallery that holds iconic works like Liberty Leading the People and the Raft of the Médecins. Directly to the south is the Grand Gallery, a sweeping exhibition hall filled with masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and other Italian giants. Connecting those 2 spaces is the Sala des États, which is where the Mona Lisa lives, alongside the Wedding at Cana and several other major works. And tucked into the eastern corner of the Salle des États is the Galerie d'Apollon. This gallery sits just 250 meters from the Mona Lisa and only 800 meters from the headquarters of the French National Police. Inside, 9 display cases line the walls, showcasing the French royal jewel collection. This is also the exact room where the sword of Charlemagne was stolen back in 1906. Nobody could have imagined that 49 years later, almost to the letter, the same story would play out in the very same room. October 19, 2025, a Sunday, the single busiest day of the week at the Louvre. The museum had just opened, And more than half an hour in, the majority of visitors were still making their way through the security lines at the entrance, which also meant that the bulk of the security staff was concentrated right there at the front of the building. Deep inside the museum, near the Galerie d'Apollon, one of the on-duty guards suddenly heard a loud noise echo through the corridor. At first, he didn't think much of it. There had been incidents before with unruly visitors making a scene. But listening more carefully, he realized this was something different. It was a heavy, thudding sound, muffled but forceful, layered with the unmistakable grinding screech of metal on metal. Then his walkie-talkie crackled. The central control room was on the line, reporting that the alarm system inside the Galerie d'Apollon had just been triggered. All units were ordered to respond immediately. When the guard reached the gallery, what he found was far worse than anything he'd anticipated. Tourists were running, scrambling toward the exits in a panic, and moving against that tide of fleeing visitors were two men dressed in bright yellow reflective vests, one with a black mask covering his face, the other wearing a full motorcycle helmet. Each of them was holding an angle grinder. That grinding noise suddenly made perfect sense. The two men had gone straight for two of the display cases and were smashing into them with brutal force. One guard tried to push forward and intervene, but the men turned and brandished their tools like weapons, forcing him to back off. He made the call not to risk a direct confrontation and instead pulled back to a safe position, focusing on steering panicked visitors toward the nearest exits. Then, just minutes later, right in front of his eyes, the two men scooped up a large bag stuffed with jewelry and bolted from the gallery. At almost the same moment, security personnel down at the glass pyramid entrance sprinted from the ground floor toward the outside wall beneath the Galerie d'Apollon windows, trying to cut off their escape route. By the time he got there, the men were already on motorcycles, disappearing fast down the street. There was nothing he could do but watch them go. Back inside the gallery, the guard was hit by a sharp smell of gasoline. He looked around and found a wall-mounted lift with a damaged fuel tank. Gas was actively leaking out onto the floor, and a blowtorch had been left nearby. The thieves had clearly tried to set the lift on fire on their way out, intending to destroy evidence. Staff acted fast and managed to prevent what could have been a serious fire. As they checked the direction the thieves had fled, one of the guards spotted something on the ground just outside, an artifact lying in the street. It had almost certainly slipped out during the chaos of their escape. The museum immediately began evacuating visitors from the affected area and announced it would be closing for the rest of the day due to a, quote, special circumstance. Once staff completed a full inventory, the scope of the loss became clear. 8 pieces of Napoleon-era jewelry had been taken, with a combined value of 88 million euros. Let's go through what was actually stolen, because the individual pieces are extraordinary. First was a sapphire set, a tiara, a necklace, and a pair of earrings worn together as a matching ensemble. The tiara alone was set with 24 sapphires and 1,083 diamonds. This was jewelry that French Queen Marie Antoinette had actually worn. Then there was an emerald set, a necklace and earrings with 32 emeralds running through the necklace alongside 1,138 diamonds. This particular set had been a wedding gift from Napoleon I to his wife Marie-Louise. The museum had paid 3.7 million euros to acquire it. The remaining pieces had all belonged to Empress Eugénie, the wife of Napoleon III, a woman widely considered one of the most fashionable and glamorous figures of her entire era. Those pieces included a pearl tiara strung with 212 pearls and 1,998 diamonds, a knight's cross brooch set with 94 diamonds, and an elaborate floral brooch crafted from gold, silver, and diamonds. The museum had spent 6.72 million euros to bring those pieces into its collection. The artifact the guard found lying in the street turned out to be Empress Eugénie's pearl diadem, the item that was supposed to be the 9th piece the thieves had intended to grab. It was composed of 56 emeralds and 1,354 diamonds. When it was recovered, it was partially damaged. The museum announced it would do everything in its power to restore it. Looking at everything on that stolen list, one thing becomes immediately obvious. the criminals knew exactly what they were after. Every single piece was heavily loaded with diamonds, precious stones, gold, and silver. And there's a very specific reason for that. In any major art or jewelry theft, stealing the item is actually the easier half of the problem. The harder part is figuring out how to sell it afterward. Remember the Mona Lisa theft? Precisely because that painting was so recognizable and impossible to move, Perugia eventually had to reach out to an Italian antique dealer, and that's exactly how he got caught. These royal jewels carry the same problem. Every single one of them is famous, well-documented, and impossible to sell intact on any legitimate market. But, and this is the key, they can be broken apart. The stones can be removed, the metal melted down, the gems recut into entirely new shapes. Once that process is complete, tracing any of it back to the original pieces becomes nearly impossible. That's what makes them so attractive as targets. And that's precisely why, for law enforcement, the first 48 hours after a theft like this are absolutely critical. If investigators can identify suspects and move quickly enough, there's still a real chance of recovering the pieces before they're dismantled forever. The moment that alarm went off in the control room, staff hit the emergency alert button without hesitation. Police were dispatched immediately, but by the time they arrived on scene, the thieves were already gone. Officers cordoned off the museum entrances and the surrounding streets, then began a methodical sweep of the entire area. Inside the Galerie d'Apollon, they found where the criminals had gotten in, a shattered window on the exterior wall, the glass blown inward, the frame destroyed. That was the entry point. Inside the gallery itself, the fourth and fifth display cases had been smashed open, while every other case in the room remained completely untouched. That detail was significant. The thieves hadn't wandered around looking for targets. They had walked in knowing exactly which cases they wanted. This was deliberate and pre-planned. As for evidence left behind, the criminals had been anything but clean. Scattered around the scene were a motorcycle helmet, a pair of gloves, a walkie-talkie, an angle grinder, a blanket, and the wall-mounted lift itself. Police brought in over 100 personnel to comb through every inch of ground the thieves had covered, ultimately collecting 150 separate pieces of evidence, fingerprints, DNA samples, trace materials, all of it packaged up and rushed to the crime lab. At the same time, investigators pulled surveillance footage from inside the museum, from the exterior cameras, and from traffic cameras on the surrounding streets, working to piece together exactly how the thieves had moved before, during, and after the robbery. What they reconstructed was this: 4 people had been involved in the theft in total. After grabbing the jewelry, all 4 jumped on 2 motorcycles and rode along the Seine River, heading toward the A6 highway out of the city. At some point, they switched vehicles, transferring into a small white van and continuing south. Police located one of the motorcycles abandoned along the road, but here's where investigators caught a frustrating break. The exterior wall of the Galerie d'Apollon had only a single surveillance camera, and it was pointed west. It captured nothing of the thieves scaling the balcony and breaking in. Despite that gap, the DNA results came back fast. Police quietly identified their suspects and began surveillance operations. About a month after the robbery, they moved, arresting 10 people in rapid succession. After extensive interrogation and investigation, 5 of those 10 were confirmed to have played a role in the crime. A man identified only as A, a man named Abdoulaye, a man named Slimane, along with his wife, and a 4th suspect known by the nickname XH4. The remaining 6 were cleared and released. So who were these people? Let's start with A. 34 years old, originally from Algeria, he'd been living in France for the past 15 years. He'd worked as a delivery driver and a waste collector at various points, but at the time of the robbery, he was unemployed. The DNA link that tied him to the crime came from the abandoned motorcycle. After the heist, he tried to board a flight back to Algeria. He was arrested at the airport. Then there's Abdoulaye, 39 years old. His DNA turned up on a shard of glass from one of the smashed display cases. His background reads like a portrait of a difficult life. His father, a former airport employee, had been married 3 times and fathered 23 children in total. After retiring, the father had returned to Mali. Following the robbery, Abdoulaye had been planning to go there and lay low with his family. He was arrested before he could make it out. Growing up poor, Abdoulaye had dropped out of middle school. By the time of the Louvre theft, he already had 15 prior convictions. The most serious of those came 11 years earlier when he robbed a jewelry store at fake gunpoint and fled on a motorcycle. After serving that sentence, he bounced between jobs, warehouse work, driving an illegal taxi, doing deliveries. At one point, he'd even worked as a security guard at the Centre Pompidou. But outside of all that, Abdoulaye had another life entirely, one that his neighbors and online followers knew him for. From a young age, he'd been obsessed with motorcycles. He started posting stunt videos and long-distance ride footage on YouTube, built up a solid following, and became something of a legend in the local riding community. His slogan, "Always stick to the track," got passed around among young motorcycle enthusiasts all over the city. More recently, he'd moved to TikTok, and the motorcycle he rode in those videos, the exact same model as the one used in the robbery. 1 month before the crime, he went quiet on social media almost entirely. Neighbors, when interviewed by investigators, described him as honest, generous, and kind, the last person they'd ever suspect of something like this. One Paris taxi driver came forward after seeing Abdoulaye's face in the news. He told investigators that about a month before the heist, his cab had run out of gas and stalled right in the middle of a busy road, and he was staring down a fine. Cars were piling up behind him, horns blaring. Abdoulaye was the only person who stopped. He got out, helped tow the taxi out of traffic, then calmly told the driver to call his insurance company for a tow truck and walked away. The taxi driver said he seemed quiet, steady, and genuinely decent. He was completely blindsided when he found out who Abdoulaye really was. A and Abdoulaye were the first 2 taken into custody, and they were the 2 men in the yellow reflective vests caught on camera smashing through the display cases. Both denied everything at first, loudly and repeatedly. It took 96 straight hours of intense interrogation before they finally broke and admitted their involvement. The third suspect was Slimane, 37 years old, Abdoulaye's cousin. By day, he worked in amateur football. He had 11 prior convictions, 10 of them for theft, and had previously committed crimes alongside Abdoulaye. His DNA was found on the wall-mounted lift. His wife, 38 years old and the mother of his children, was also pulled into the investigation. A small amount of her DNA had turned up on the lift as well. She denied any involvement whatsoever, arguing that DNA from her personal belongings could have been transferred to the lift secondhand without her knowledge. The fourth suspect, XH4, was 39 years old with 4 prior convictions. On the day of the robbery, he and Slimane had been stationed outside the museum as lookouts. When it was over, they were the ones on the motorcycles who swept in to help A and Abdoulaye make their getaway. Given how organized the whole operation looked, the specific targets, the equipment, the speed of execution, investigators initially assumed they were dealing with a professional criminal outfit. Some even floated the possibility of an inside job, someone within the museum feeding information to the thieves. That kind of thing has happened before. In 2006, the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, discovered that 221 artifacts worth roughly $5 million had gone missing from its collection. When investigators finally cracked the case, they found out it had been an inside job all along, a museum employee who had quietly been walking pieces out the door since 1992, with an audacity that was almost hard to believe. So the suspicion wasn't unreasonable. But as police dug deeper into the Louvre suspects, the professional criminal theory started to fall apart. These men were from Seine-Saint-Denis, a working-class area on the outskirts of Paris with a large North African immigrant population and some of the lowest income levels in the region. Their backgrounds were nothing like the slick, sophisticated art thieves you see in movies. Their prior offenses were small-time stuff. And the fact that they'd fumbled and dropped one of the pieces during the escape pointed pretty clearly to a crew that wasn't exactly experienced at this level. There was also zero evidence connecting any of them to anyone inside the museum. What made the whole thing even stranger was what came out during the early stages of interrogation. These men genuinely had no idea what they had just robbed. Abdoulaye believed the Louvre was essentially just the glass pyramid, a landmark, a tourist photo op, and that the building he'd broken into was just some ordinary structure nearby. A had figured that since it was a Sunday, the museum would be closed and the area around it would be quiet. As for why they did it at all, the four of them told police that roughly 2 weeks before the robbery, they'd been approached by two men speaking with a Slavic accent. These men had offered them 15,000 euros to rob what they described as a regular store. That was the job as far as A, Abdoulaye, Slimane, and XH4 understood it. A straightforward smash and grab, nothing more. Police, however, were not buying the idea that any of this had been spontaneous or improvised. The evidence pointed clearly to a heist that had been carefully planned well in advance by someone, even if the four men carrying it out had been kept in the dark about the true nature of the target. And as more surveillance footage surfaced online in the days after the robbery, and as the suspects' testimonies were pieced together, the full picture of how this thing had actually been put together began to emerge. Starting about a month before the crime, several unregistered burner phones had been active in the vicinity of the Louvre. Police couldn't trace them through conventional means, but their presence strongly suggested that someone had been doing reconnaissance, scoping out visitor patterns, security rotations, staffing density. Then came the matter of the wall-mounted lift, the single most important piece of equipment used in the robbery. It hadn't been purchased through any professional channel. The thieves had found it listed on a second-hand goods website by a private seller. They contacted him, claimed they wanted to meet in person to complete the transaction, and arranged a time and place. Here's where it gets almost too strange to believe. The seller lived in a small town called Louvre in the French province of Var. Louvre, one letter away from Louvre. 9 days before the robbery, the seller waited for his buyers to show up. They did show up, just not to buy anything. They showed up, threatened him, and took the lift by force without paying a single euro. Weeks later, watching the news coverage of the Louvre theft, the seller recognized his own equipment in the footage. Weeks later, watching the news coverage of the Louvre theft, the seller recognized his own equipment in the footage. On the morning of October 19th at 9 a.m. sharp, the four men rolled up to the Louvre. They came with the wall-mounted lift loaded on a vehicle and two motorcycles. They positioned everything along the side of the building that faces the Seine River, a spot that looked directly up at the balcony at the far end of the Galerie d'Apollon. Now, here's the thing. The Louvre happened to be in the middle of exterior renovation work at the time, so a lift parked against the building's outer wall didn't raise a single eyebrow. On top of that, the four men were dressed in yellow reflective vests and motorcycle helmets, looking every bit like a construction crew showing up for the morning shift. They even set out traffic cones around the area to complete the illusion. To anyone passing by, it was just another work site. Nobody gave them a second look. At 9:34 a.m., A and Abdoulaye rode the lift up to the balcony window. The window had no security reinforcement of any kind, just ordinary glass with no protective film, no bars, nothing. They smashed through it in seconds and dropped inside the Galerie d'Apollon. The alarm triggered immediately. But they didn't slow down for even a moment. They went straight for the fourth and fifth display cases, their pre-selected targets. That's when they hit their first real obstacle. These weren't ordinary display cases. They were built with bulletproof glass, the kind that laughs at an angle grinder. Even bearing down hard, the tool was barely making a dent. And making things worse, the cases were fitted with vibration sensors, so the moment they started working on them, a second alarm went off. That's when the nerves started to kick in. Both men knew that every second they spent fighting those cases was another second for the police to close the distance. So A made a decision. He killed the angle grinder, grabbed a crowbar, and started hammering the glass with everything he had, throwing his elbows into it alongside the bar. It took everything they had, but eventually the glass gave way, cracking open just enough. a rough, hand-sized hole. They reached in and started pulling out jewelry as fast as their hands could move. In one of the videos that later circulated online, you can see a figure in a yellow vest wailing on that display case, while everyone around him has frozen in place, tourists too stunned or too terrified to do anything but stare. The two men grabbed what they could and ran straight back out onto the balcony. What they left behind, sitting in the same case they just cracked open, was the Regent diamond, 140 carats, valued at around 50 million euros, one of the most famous gems in the world. There's an old theory that the Regent diamond carries a curse. King Louis XVI had it set into his crown and was later sent to the guillotine. Napoleon incorporated it into his personal accessories and ended up exiled. Whether by superstition or simply by the chaos of the moment, the thieves never touched it. At 9:37 a.m., A and Abdoulaye came back down the lift, carrying 9 pieces of jewelry in total, not 8 as initially reported. Someone on the ground caught the moment on camera. In the footage, a voice crackles over a walkie-talkie. "Those people are on motorcycles, they're about to leave." Almost certainly a security guard somewhere in the building. At 9:38 a.m., all 4 men were on their motorcycles and gone. The whole operation, from the moment they went up that lift to the moment they disappeared down the street, took less than 7 minutes. The time A and Abdoulaye actually spent inside the Galerie d'Apollon was 3 minutes and 52 seconds. The method they used to get in, scaling the exterior, smashing a window, breaking into the gallery, was almost a carbon copy of how the sword of Charlemagne had been stolen from that same room back in 1976. Same building, same gallery, nearly half a century apart. The moment news of the robbery broke, it exploded across the globe. No laser grids, no hacking, no elaborate disguises or Mission Impossible-style gadgetry, just 4 guys, a stolen lift, some angle grinders, and 7 minutes. People online couldn't stop talking about it. The joke that spread fastest was that great truths are simple, that the most jaw-dropping crimes in history often come down to the most straightforward execution imaginable. And then, in one of the stranger footnotes to the whole story, a German company realized that the lift the thieves had used was one of their models. That same night, they reportedly cooked up a new advertising slogan: "When you need to act quickly, at a speed of 42 meters per minute, transporting up to 400 kilograms of treasures silently." 3 days after the robbery, the Louvre reopened its doors to the public. The Galerie d'Apollon stayed closed. Behind the scenes, the museum had quietly moved a significant portion of its remaining collection into the vault of the Bank of France, located less than 500 meters away, with a vault sitting 27 meters underground. Holding 90% of France's entire gold reserves and protected by some of the most formidable security in the country. In the aftermath, the Louvre's own director went on record admitting that the museum's exterior camera network had serious blind spots, gaps that the thieves had exploited perfectly. But the problems ran much deeper than just the outside cameras. Inside the museum, the situation was arguably worse. A staggering 61% of the Louvre's galleries have no surveillance cameras at all. And this wasn't a surprise to anyone paying attention. Back in 2018, an internal audit had specifically flagged the balcony of the Galerie d'Apollon as one of the museum's most critical security vulnerabilities. The report had even walked through a scenario in which thieves used a lift to access that exact balcony. It was, almost beat for beat, a blueprint for what actually happened 7 years later. Former security staff revealed that over the previous 15 years, the Louvre had quietly eliminated around 200 full-time positions, roughly 1 in every 10 jobs at the museum. Just 4 months before the robbery, workers had staged a strike over the chronic understaffing, arguing that they simply didn't have enough people to manage the crowds and protect the collection at the same time. They had raised the alarm about security gaps. Nobody in a position of authority had taken it seriously enough to act. A man with first-hand experience robbing bank vaults later pointed out another critical flaw that most people missed entirely. During a 2019 renovation of the Galerie d'Apollon, the museum had ended up with two generations of display cases sitting side by side, old and new. The older cases had a built-in failsafe. If tampering was detected, the jewelry inside would automatically drop down into a secure vault beneath the floor. The newer replacement cases had no such mechanism. The two cases the thieves targeted on October 19th were both the new ones. And then there was perhaps the single most embarrassing detail to come out of the entire investigation: the password protecting the server that managed the Louvre's entire surveillance network was, in full capital letters, the word Louvre. In the wake of all of this, museum management announced a sweeping security overhaul, 100 new exterior cameras to be installed by 2026, along with a full suite of anti-intrusion measures. To help fund it all, the Louvre announced that starting May 14, 2026, ticket prices would be going up for visitors from outside the European Economic Area. As of now, A. Abdoulaye, Slimane, and XH4 have all been formally indicted on charges of organized theft and complicity. Slimane's wife faces charges of aiding organized theft and complicity. A conviction on organized theft charges carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison, along with substantial financial penalties. 4 people are in custody, and yet the jewelry, 88 million euros worth of Napoleon-era royal treasures, is still out there somewhere. Investigators may continue tracking leads through international black markets and major gem trading hubs like Antwerp, hoping to intercept the pieces before they're broken apart. But some experts think the jewels may never resurface for sale at all, that they're already locked away in a private vault somewhere, invisible to the world. If that's the case, these centuries-old pieces of royal history could end up sharing the same fate as the sword of Charlemagne, gone for 49 years and counting, swallowed by the darkness, never to be seen in public again. The Louvre Heist reads like a Hollywood screenplay, and yet it happened. 4 suspects caught, a global investigation, 150 pieces of evidence, and still the jewels are missing. Maybe sitting on someone's black market shelf, maybe melted down already into something unrecognizable. The Louvre has stood for centuries as one of humanity's greatest symbols, a place that exists specifically to protect and preserve what we've created, what we've inherited, what we've deemed worth remembering. And again, throughout its history, that protection has failed. From a man casually pocketing a statue and walking out the front door, to 4 guys with a stolen lift pulling off a 7-minute robbery in broad daylight, history keeps proving the same uncomfortable truth: no security system is perfect. Every wall has a crack. Every blind spot is an opportunity for someone willing to look for it. Will those diamonds and emeralds ever catch the light in public again? Or are they already gone, recut, reborn, their history erased? That question may never have an answer, and that's the part that lingers. Because when the darkness of crime reaches into a place built to protect the light of human history, it isn't just a museum that loses something, it's all of us. That's it for today. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.